Welcome. My name is Jamena McInteer. I'm a senior front-end developer here in Austin, Texas. So for those of you out of town, welcome to my town. I have been coding for over a decade, and I have about 3.5 years of Vue experience. So I'll be talking to you about bringing CSS into your Vue app. I'll be talking. I have a GitHub repository here. There's a link to it where I have a couple of examples that I'll be talking about in this talk, as well as the link to the slides and a couple of resources for reading material. You can also visit my website at jamena.dev, and in the talk section, I have the link to the GitHub repository for this talk as well. So bringing CSS into a Vue app, this is kind of a big topic. CSS is kind of a complex. It can get very complex very quickly. There are lots of options out there for working with CSS in Vue. So I wanted to talk about a couple of concepts about using CSS and then go into CSS methodologies you might want to adopt and end with some UI frameworks. So the first topic I want to bring up is scope CSS. So in Vue template files, if you're using Vue CLI, you're going to have these .vue template files. They come with support for style tags right out of the box. So in your Vue template files, you'll have the template section for your HTML, the script section for your JavaScript, and then you'll also have a style section for styles. And these will be global styles for your component and your entire app. However, if you use the scoped attribute, then you're going to be able to limit styles to just that component. So what this means is if you have global styles that should be used throughout your app, you just use a style tag. You could use that in app.vue, for example. That could make it simpler. Just put all your global styles in there. It'll be visible throughout your app. But then if you have the scoped attribute, those styles will only be visible in that component. So note that if a child component's root element has a class that also exists in the parent element, then the parent component styles could leak to the child component. So this is a case where it might be useful to adopt a CSS methodology, which I'll cover later, so that you have less leakage, you have more control over your styles, and you don't have these generic classes that end up in somewhere you don't intend, and you have unintended consequences, unintended styles, because you're using generic styles. So again, I'll cover CSS methodologies later. Here I have an example of a small snippet of Vue showing the template section and the style section of a .vue file. So this would be a global style. So we have .example as the class, color red. Any element in your app that has the example class is now going to be color red. It's going to, hello world here is going to be red, as well as any other element with the example class. So this is an example of a global style. In this example, we have you're using the scope tag. This is going to make our CSS local. It's scoped to the component. So in this example, the class example still color red. The hello world is going to be red here for this component, but if you use the example class anywhere else in another component, it's not going to be red. So how does this work? So what Vue does is it injects, if you're using scope styles, it injects a data v attribute with some generated string at the end into the HTML. So we end up with a div with the class example, which is what we had originally used, and then some data attribute. And then in the style tag, Vue will combine our class.example with the data attribute in brackets. So that's how Vue is selecting and locally scoping our CSS. So the second concept I want to cover is CSS modules. This is an out-of-the-box alternative to scope CSS. So Vue CLI already comes with support for this. All you need to do is use the module attribute in the style tag instead of the scoped attribute. And then instead of using class equals example like we did when using scoped CSS, we're going to use class binding, so that's the colon class syntax or the vbind colon class syntax to access a $style object. So this is a little bit different. We have a JavaScript object that we're accessing, and we can pass that on to children as props as well, instead of a simple class like we might be used to in regular CSS. So here's an example of how that might work. We have a style tag like we did before, but instead of scoped, we have module. And again, example is color red, but then in the div element there, we're using class binding. So that's the colon class syntax to access $style dot example. So dot example is going to be that's our property, which is referencing that class. So again, how does that work? So what Vue ends up doing is creating a new class and changing the class of that element to this new class. And that class starts with the name of the component at the beginning, underscore, underscore, and then the class that we had originally created here, dot example, then underscore, underscore, and some generated string. So one nice thing about this is if you're looking at your HTML and you're trying to debug, you'll see right away, oh, that's the component it belongs to, that's the class it belongs to. Whereas with scoped CSS, it might be a little bit harder because we just have these data v attributes that don't tell us what component we're working with at all. And then the HTML looks a little more normal, if I can call it that, because we have a class, a regular class there instead of the data v attribute. We can also use the export keyword in CSS modules to export values from the CSS into the JavaScript. So that could potentially be a really cool thing. Usually we don't have values from CSS going into JavaScript. But by using that export keyword, we can do that. So in this example, I'm actually using a preprocessor here, which I'll be covering next. So I'm using SCSS. I'm creating a variable color and assigning it to red. And then I'm using that colon export keyword and assigning that $color to a property primary color. So I'm creating a new property primary color. And then in my template, I am accessing the primary color property off of the $style object, just like any other JavaScript object. So I'm using the double brace syntax and then accessing $style.primary color. So when this renders on the screen, it's literally going to print out the word red. So that's a value that's coming from CSS through JavaScript and being rendered on the screen. So CSS module, if you're using CSS modules, the classes, the styles are all local by default. But if you use this colon global parentheses dot example syntax, you can make certain styles global. So you can still use the CSS modules class binding, but you can make them global by using this syntax. And then if you're using a preprocessor like SCSS in the second example, it can make that a bit nicer. You can create a whole nested block of global styles. So you use the colon global and then add all of your classes nested into that. So that can be really nice to just create a nice global block of styles. Okay, so now I want to review preprocessors. So preprocessors, some examples would be less, SASS, and Stylus. This is styles that you write that become compiled into CSS. You're not actually writing CSS at that point. They can be added as separate files in Vue, so you can use .less, .sass, .stylus files. You can also do that with regular CSS files, just create separate files and import them. Or you can use the style tag, and as you saw in the previous examples, use the lang attribute to use a specific preprocessor. And this is recommended instead of using the separate files. If you prefer to work with separate files, that's totally possible, it's totally your call. However, the one issue that could arise if you're not careful is if you want to remove a component in the future, if some feature becomes deprecated, it can be hard to know if a style was used elsewhere. You know, am I going to break something by removing this component? And that's where you end up with lots of code bloat, lots of technical debt. So the nice thing about using the style tag, which Vue comes with, is suddenly whenever you want to remove a component, you just remove it, and all of the styles go with it. So if you're using Vue CLI 3 when creating a project, you can choose a preprocessor right there during the creation process. If you want to add a preprocessor to a current project, then you will need to install the loader and the preprocessor. So for example, SASS, we have npm install, and then we have SASS loader and SASS. For less, we need less loader and less, and for Stylus, we need Stylus loader and Stylus. And then, again, we can use the lang attribute in our style tag, or import separate files if you prefer to do that. So here's an example using SCSS. Again, with the lang attribute is SCSS, and then we're using a variable and a class. So this here is going to be a global style using SCSS as our preprocessor. So we're not using the scoped attribute or the module attribute in this case. So I want to cover CSS and JS now. This is something that you might have heard a lot from the React community. There's a lot of work around CSS and JS being done in the React community, but it's not commonly used in Vue. And part of that is how Vue and React treat HTML differently. So in React, we're writing HTML in our JavaScript in the form of JSX. So it makes sense that CSS would also be written in JavaScript in the same way and with the same kind of philosophy. But with Vue, we're writing our JavaScript in our HTML. So we're using the V attributes, we're using the double braces in our HTML. So the CSS and JS just doesn't come up as often in Vue. Vue also already comes with a lot of great options out of the box. I mean, we don't have to fight how to deal with CSS as much as in React. So there's really no reason to go into CSS and JS. However, if you want to try it, it actually is possible. You could play around with it. There's a fork for styled components called Vue styled components. And then it takes a little bit of effort, but you actually can get Aphrodite working in Vue as well. So you would need to look into that. But again, since CSS and JS isn't common in Vue, its documentation is likely to be spotty, so I wouldn't recommend it in a production app until you've tried it and figured out that it is going to work in a larger, more robust app. Vue also comes with support for dynamic style attributes. So this is the vbind style or the colon style attribute for inline styles in Vue. This is not a good strategy for using CSS throughout your app as your main strategy, but it can be good for toggles, for switches, for on-off kind of things, but use it sparingly. With inline styles, it's hard to override the styles. They have very high specificity, and they don't support media queries. So it's best to avoid it except when you actually need to use it. All right, now I want to cover CSS methodologies. So what are CSS methodologies? They're a set of rules for writing CSS. So CSS can, as it grows, as the app grows and you start adding more CSS, it can get unwieldy and you can end up fighting the cascade instead of using it to your advantage. So the idea behind CSS methodologies is we put a set of rules together of how we're going to write CSS, of how we're going to write our classes, and that helps bring more maintainability to the app and keep CSS under control. It helps reduce specificity. You don't have to do as much nesting, so it's better in that respect. So these are some of the more popular CSS methodologies. The most popular right now is BEM, B-E-M. Second most popular is Atomic CSS. I want to cover BEM today just to kind of give you an idea of what a CSS methodology is and how it might look like. But any of these others could be interesting reading as well. So BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. So here I have an example of a really simple card app. I have a card with a title that says a picture of a cat, and then I have an image and 2 buttons. In BEM, a block would be the card app. So the card app would be considered a block in BEM. And then within the block, either as children or grandchildren, we're going to have all of these different elements. So that's the block element in BEM. And then if you notice, there are two buttons. So they're both the same element. They're both buttons, but one is a secondary button. So that's going to need a modifier. So that's your block element modifier in BEM. So this card, if you were to write it in HTML with BEM classes, might look something like this. So your block is going to have a class of card. That's your block class. And then each of the elements is going to have its own class, starting with card, which is your block, underscore, underscore, whatever the name of the element is. So for example, I have the title as class card, underscore, underscore, title, and then I have the same for image, card, image, and then the 2 buttons have the class card, underscore, underscore, button. Now when it comes to modifiers, that's the second button there. We add a class with the format card or block, underscore, underscore, button, or the element, hyphen, hyphen, the modifier. And this is added in the class list in addition to the element. So it's going to have all the styles that the main button has, but then the modifier class is going to change that in some way. So in this case, we're removing the background image, and we're changing the color of, or the background color, and we're changing the color of the text. So that's what the modifier class is going to be doing. So that's kind of a quick overview of BEM, which is a CSS methodology, and others have other rules and other philosophies around it. But that's kind of an idea of how it might be useful to get CSS under control by having rules around your classes. So now I want to cover UI frameworks. So UI frameworks can be helpful for faster development. It may cut down on the design time. So if you're not a designer, or if you're wanting to get something up fast, a UI framework can really help with that. However, they're usually going to be harder to customize. You're going to have to override their styles or their colors in some way. But they can help cut down on design time, cut down on development time. So here is a list of some of the more popular UI frameworks used in Vue. I am going to be covering Vuetify and Vuefy today, as well as Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS is actually not a Vue or a UI framework. It's a CSS framework, but I'll be covering that since it's been growing in popularity in the Vue community. So Vuetify was created out of this desire to merge the material design trend with Vue. It provides server-side rendering, progressive web app capability, and over 82 components. And it also comes with pre-made themes, both free and premium themes. If you want to create a project using Vuetify, you can use the Vue create in Vue CLI to create a project, CD into it, and then do Vue add Vuetify. You can also just do Vue add Vuetify to a current project if you want to add it, and then npm run serve is going to run that in your local host. So here I have an example of a really simple app that I built using Vuetify. To kind of show you how this might come together if you're using Vuetify as a UI framework. So this uses the dog API, and I have a link to it in my GitHub repository if you want to take a look. But it pulls 6 random images and displays them of 6 random corgis. And then if you click on the Get More Images, it'll refresh the images and grab 6 more random images. So this is an example of the templates section of the app.vue file. And we're using Vuetify components here. We have the Vue App component, the Vue App bar component, and then we're using attributes like app, color, dark to control how we want it to look. And then we can also pass in classes to change up how it looks with different breakpoints, or to change the margins or padding or spacing. We can pass those classes into HTML elements as well as Vue components. And they have documentation on the Vuetify site about all the different components you can have and the different attributes and how that's going to control how things look. And then here is a child component, the template section of a child component. This is the corgigrid.vue file. And again, this is a simple example showing rows and columns using Vuetify components. So we have the vContainer, vRow, vColumn, and then we also have vButton, which is our orange button to show more images when it's clicked. And Vuetify is really nice that it brings this ability to show a spinner whenever you click the button until the app gets the data. So they make it really easy where if I click the button, it'll show a spinner and the button will be disabled until the app has the data again. So Vuetify makes it really easy to do that instead of having to roll your own spinner and do kind of a show hide thing. And then there's different classes here. There's the MA8 that's going to be margin. I see a PA2 that's padding. So there are different classes that are used to control how this looks. So Vuetify is another UI framework. It's merging the CSS framework Bulma with Vue. It's really lightweight, so that's one of the pros for it. However, it only has about 41 components, so it's not quite as robust as Vuetify. So it might be good for really getting off the ground quickly if you're trying to do a POC, but it's not as robust as Vuetify. But it is lightweight, so that's definitely a pro for it. Similar to Vuetify, we can create a Vue project, CD into it. Instead of Vue add, we're using npm install Vuetify, so the installation is a little, there's a little more to it than with Vuetify. Here I have the same app built with Vuetify, so it looks about the same, but it's essentially the columns, the rows, the header, and the button there. So this is the template section of the app.vue for this app. Now something you might notice right off the bat that's different is that instead of using Vuetify components, so that was like the Vue App bar, we're using HTML elements with classes. So Vuetify gives us a lot of different classes and documentation for how to build these components using these classes, but not so much, it doesn't have its own components as much, except for form elements. It does have a lot of its own components for form elements. So you end up with HTML that has a lot of classes instead of your own Vuetify components. In order to change the colors for Vuetify, I needed to add the support for SCSS, so I had to install the SASS loader and use style lang equals SCSS here. This is in the app.vue where I'm importing the Bulma SCSS styles, and then I'm overriding those variables with my own colors, and then importing some more SCSS there that gets overridden. So again, installation is a bit more involved if you want to customize Vuetify. And then this is the template section of the corgigrid.vue file. Again, lots of classes here, and no custom components, actually, no Vuetify components in this case. So Tailwind CSS, this is a CSS framework. It's not a Vue or a UI framework. It's a utility-first CSS framework. So it provides low-level utility classes instead of pre-designed components. So what does this mean? For example, if you're building a card component, instead of bringing in like a vCard component, like you might in Vuetify, or like a div class equals card maybe in Vuetify. I don't know if that's the actual class, but something like that. With Tailwind, you use these utility classes to build a component. So you might have a div, and then you add the class, a class for shadow, you add a class for padding, you add a class for margin, you add a class for width, and then within the card component, you add classes to all of the elements to define how they're going to look. So it's a completely different type of writing completely different type of framework than something like Vuetify or Vuetify. This ends up creating a lot of classes in the HTML, but it also means you can customize it a lot. So you can add and remove utility classes to change up how you want it to look instead of having to override styles like you do in the other frameworks. So here's an example of a card component. This is from the Tailwind site. So on the left is the card, and on the right is the HTML with all of the classes. So again, there's no card class, there's no card component necessarily. It's HTML that has all of these utility classes, and there's a lot of them there, to create what we're seeing on the screen on the left side. So again, we have the rounded class, we've got the shadow class, and that's on the parent card component. And then for the image, we've got a full width class. And then, let's see, for the title, we've got some font bolding, we're making the text large, giving it some padding around that. And then with the chips, we've got some background colors, and it's rounded. So again, lots of classes in the HTML. So some people really like this approach to just have lots of utility classes. And then with Vue, you can create your own component or kind of your own UI library by creating these card components that have all of these utility classes, and then you yourself could import a card component throughout your app, using a V whatever card component if you're creating your own UI library or whatever you're calling it. But some people don't like all of this HTML, and they would prefer to use discrete classes that are specific for a card component. Installing Tailwind CSS is a bit more involved than installing Vuetify or even Vuefy. It's not a Vue framework, and it's not a UI framework, so it needs a bit more work to get it running. I actually have a link to an article in the GitHub repository that might help get you started with that. Since Tailwind CSS is a utility first CSS framework, there's going to be a lot of classes in there that you're never going to use. There's going to be a lot of utility classes that you're just never going to touch because you don't need it for your project. So you'll want to install Purge CSS and get that set up to get rid of any bloat, any extra classes that you'll never use. Okay, so there are lots of options in the CSS world. How do you choose what you're going to use? Are you going to use styled components? Are you going to use CSS modules or the scoped style? How do you choose? Well, some of the decision for choosing how you're going to approach CSS in your app and with your team is, what are you familiar with? Is your team used to using scope CSS or used to CSS modules? Are you building a POC, a proof of concept that you need to quickly get off the ground, and you'd rather use a UI framework and not have to deal with the design? So a lot of that's going to come down to specifically your project, your team, but hopefully this is a good overview of all the different options that are out there. So thank you for coming to my talk. I can be found on Twitter and my website if you have questions.